A House Full of Daughters by Juliet Nicolson.
Pepita, my great-great-grandmother, was born in 1830 in the throbbing, poverty-riddled city of Malaga. Her father, Pedro Duran, was a barber, while the local glamour of her gypsy mother, Catalina Ortega, was enhanced by rumours that, as a young girl, she'd earned money leaping through hoops at a circus. The family lived in a maze of slums not far from the river, where the heavy air, thick with southern heat, was impregnated with the smell of rancid olive oil, rotten fish, fresh manure, and the combined scent of crushed cinnamon and chocolate. In Pepita's day, Malaga was an ancient, bandit-riddled city, encircled by vine-clothed hills, a rough place to live. When Pepita was 6 years old, her father was killed in a brawl during a street procession. His widow was left alone with their 2 children, Pepita and her brother Diego. Catalina took in washing from neighbours and the local hotels and began selling women's clothes, knocking on doors in alleys so narrow that it was possible to shake hands across the streets by leaning out of the protruding top windows. In Malaga, dance is all around you, in the streets, in the cafes, in the cellars. Pepita learned to dance at the Flamenco school near her house as soon as she learned to walk. She took at once to the lessons that her mother worked so hard to pay for, performing with a lightness and a delicacy that outshone the other students. In 1849, when Pepita was 19, she and her mother travelled to Madrid, where Catalina, whose determination to get her way was often hard to resist, persuaded a reluctant Antonio Ruiz, the director of ballet at the Teatro del Príncipe, to give Pepita an audition. Enchanted by Catalina's lovely daughter, Ruiz decided to try and mould her to the theatre's own dancing standards and agreed to arrange lessons for her. But the lessons were not a success, and Ruiz cancelled them with baffling speed. Catalina remained convinced that her daughter was as gifted as any of the greatest Spanish dancers. During their visit to the capital, mother and daughter had met a young ballet teacher, Juan Antonio Gabriel de la Oliva. Being a Spaniard of hot blood and ardent feelings, he accepted Catalina's invitation to give Pepita dancing lessons, and within the time it took to perfect a stretch of the foot and an arch of the arm, he had fallen in love with his pupil. Under his tuition, Pepita began to shine, her reputation growing with every performance and beginning to spread throughout Spain. 2 years later, Catalina gave their betrothal her blessing, but she assumed that Pepita's daughterly loyalty and devotion to her mother would remain unthreatened and intact. On her wedding day, Pepita chose to wear black lace in the Andalusian marital tradition. After the ceremony, the protracted celebrations began with coffee and chocolate in the popular Café Suizo, followed by a family dinner where a feast of Andalusian dishes, salty, deep-fried anchovies, tangy sweet orange, cod and potato salad, and delicious cinnamony almond milk went on long into the night. Unprepared for the sense of loneliness and jealousy that followed her daughter's marriage to the lowly dancing teacher, Catalina panicked. Only 3 months after the wedding, she suggested to Pepita that Oliva had already been unfaithful to her. She then took Oliva to one side and informed him that his wife had betrayed him with another man. Astonishingly, despite a complete lack of evidence, both Pepita and Oliva believed her. The shaken pair began to live apart. But Catalina had forgotten how well she had taught her daughter the importance of ambition. As Pepita's reputation and popularity grew, she emerged not only from her wrecked marriage, but from under the thumb of the wrecker. She began to accept bookings in theatres all over Europe, causing a sensation wherever she went. Audiences clamoured for the newly established star of Andalusia to prove that her hair, her implausibly magnificent crowning glory, was not fake. To a roar of approval, one by one, she would pull out the pins that held the much-admired locks in place, allowing them to fall in a waterfall to her knees as she enchanted sell-out auditoriums in Bordeaux, Copenhagen, Frankfurt, Berlin, Stuttgart, Vienna, Budapest, Prague, and then triumphantly in Paris and at Her Majesty's Theatre in London. It was a year before Pepita came home. The drama and pomp surrounding the arrival of the 25-year-old star in the summer of 1855 formed a lifelong memory for those small children who lived nearby. The brass band from the adjoining village set up their enormous drum on Catalina's terrace, and the boisterous welcoming party, complete with a lavish banquet that concluded with chocolates, sweets, and liquors, went on until the break of dawn. Never had a mother made her pride in her daughter more obvious. But unknown to Catalina, Pepita had fallen in love. Lionel Sackville West was a 25-year-old attaché in the British legation in Germany. A reserved young man with a substantial beard, impressive sideburns, and a battalion of intimidating aristocratic relations at home, he was on holiday in Paris in October 1852, when one night at the theatre he spotted Pepita sitting in the stalls. Already aware of her fame, Lionel was stunned, even hypnotized, by the sight of her. He persuaded a friend who knew where Pepita was staying to take him to the Hôtel de Bade for an introduction, not, as Lionel later recalled, to a fast woman, but to an artiste and a lady and a danseuse. He later admitted, in respectfully oblique terms, that he had indeed visited Pepita with the intention of its leading up to that object, although he also swore that the actual fact came about at her solicitation. For the next 7 days and nights, the door to Pepita's hotel room remained closed and locked from the inside. And for the next 4 years, with her career at its height, Lionel and Pepita stayed in hotels all over Europe under their own names, mutually untroubled that their indifference to gossip might affect Lionel's public position as a young diplomat with prospects. Pepita had landed once again on her feet. Lionel was the 5th son of the 5th Earl Delaware, heir to the childless Lord Sackville, owner of Knowle, one of Britain's grandest and largest stately houses. 2 years later, Pepita wrote to tell her mother that she would be coming to stay, this time for an extended visit. Catalina and her lover, Manuel Lopez, were now living in a house near Granada, provided by Pepita. Casa Blanca was surrounded by 2 vineyards and beautifully kept lawns. On the 20th of May, 1858, Pepita's first child, a son, was born, and Catalina's smothering motherly spirit was once again allowed to flourish. The baby was christened Maximiliano, and known in the family as Max. Frustrated by the way motherhood occupied Pepita's time, Catalina soon quarrelled violently with her daughter, and Pepita left. Eventually, Pepita allowed Catalina to meet and be impressed by the tall, fair, good-looking and handsome man of a distinguished appearance with whom her daughter lived. On the 23rd of September, 1862, Catalina and Manuel joined Lionel at his splendid apartment in Paris, near the Arc de Triomphe, where a second child, a daughter, Victoria Josefa Dolores Catalina, was born. 4 more children appeared in quick succession, and with the expanding family came a further shrinking of Pepita's need for Catalina. She no longer made visits to Spain, and in the summer of 1866, Lionel bought her a house at Arcachon, near Bordeaux, in the southwest of France. It was near enough to Madrid, where Lionel was now first secretary at the British legation, and a train ride from his apartment in Paris. Pepita's house, the Villa Pepa in the Ville d'été, straddled the land between the sea and the long inner road, the Boulevard de la Plage. But the lavishness of the property neither fooled Pepita's Roman Catholic lip-curling neighbours nor endeared them to her. They had learned of the dubious marital arrangement of the new occupant of the Villa Pepa, and they did not approve. Each morning, Pepita, tiny but haughty, would glide past the disapproving locals, the long train of her black, lace-ruffled dress stretching out behind her like the black wake of a small boat. Running beside her, the younger children struggled to keep up, while Victoria held her mother's long plaits high to prevent them from dragging in the dusty streets. Lionel came to spend time with his young family 4 or 5 times a year. Finally, he agreed to put his name on the birth certificates of the last 3 children Pepita bore him, but divorce for Pepita remained as out of the question for a Catholic in France as it was in Spain, and Oliva was still her husband. In Lionel's long absences, life was difficult for his mistress, as she became exposed to the full force of the disapproval of smart Arcachon society. The British chaplain, if he saw the gates of Pepita's house swing open, would cross over to the other side of the boulevard with a slight shudder and walk on. Pepita's sense of alienation deepened still further when the town's Catholic priests refused her the twin comforts of absolution and communion. But at no point during her time in Arcachon did Pepita send for her own mother, their once powerful alliance and excessive love having dwindled away. The relationship between Catalina and her grandchildren was non-existent. In February 1871, Lionel spent a happy few days at Villa Pepa, looking forward to the birth of another child. 3 weeks later, 3 telegrams reached Paris at short intervals, containing ever more desperate bulletins. The baby boy, Frédéric, had not survived. Pepita herself was dangerously unwell. Lionel rushed to Arcachon to find the body of the mother of his children lying on her bed, a crucifix clasped between her fingers, with the body of the baby beside her. Sitting in the gloom of the shuttered house, barely able to understand what had happened, was Pepita's confused and frightened eldest daughter, Victoria. Lionel's request for her burial at home was declined by the church and the town officials, so Pepita was buried, on an unusually cold and snowy day, denied a headstone to mark her place in the vast, identity-smothering town cemetery. Catalina died alone and disappointed, deprived of a relationship with her grandchildren, and many years after losing all contact with Pepita, the daughter whom she had adored. In June 1881, Lionel was made the British minister to the legation in Washington, D.C. He was expected to be the host at influential receptions and parties, and as an unmarried man, he was in need of a hostess. When Queen Victoria was consulted about the prospect of a young, half-Spanish, illegitimate daughter becoming the chatelaine of the British legation in Washington, she was not only amused, but instantly sympathetic to the idea. The 19-year-old girl was given the go-ahead to cross the Atlantic in time for Christmas 1881. 20 years after the end of the Civil War, Washington had begun to buzz with social life. The eccentricity and glamour of the nation's capital appealed at once to Victoria, and she shone. The press loved her, and she loved them loving her. She has beauty, charm, modesty, grace, clothes, and taste, they wrote, as Victoria began a lifelong habit of pasting flattering comments into her scrapbook. Just as her mother Pepita had profited financially from her association with her powerful lover, so Victoria was admired for the loyalty and support she demonstrated towards her father. A year after her arrival, Victoria was invited, with her father, to the presidential mansion for a state dinner. The 16-stone wife of a senator, who was shown to a sturdy chair on the left of the president, Chester Arthur, was disconcerted to see that the illegitimate daughter of the British minister had been seated on his right. Upright, slim and elegant, Victoria took her place with confidence, and with a sort of smile that could soften the hardest of hearts, she turned to greet the president. Arthur's heart dissolved. Dinner was barely over before he could contain himself no longer. Would Miss West do him the honour of becoming his First Lady? Finding it impossible to respond with the solemnity that the president clearly expected, Victoria burst out laughing. "Mr. President," she replied as soon as she had composed herself, "you have a son older than me, and you are as old as my father." But the proposal was genuine, making its way into the carefully enumerated list of suitors in Victoria's Book of Reminiscences, and serious enough to alarm the government into issuing a denial on the 23rd of February 1883, under the headline, "The President Not to Get Married. Special Report to the World." A long time later, Victoria told her grandson Nigel that those 7 years were the greatest triumph of her life, when everything was full of hope. And yet she did not succumb once to romance during those 7 years. It was not for lack of candidates. She convinced herself that her responsibilities as a daughter prevented her from falling in love, writing to her elder brother Max that, "I am so happy with Papa, and help him in so many ways that I prefer to stay with him and take care of him." In 1884, Chester Arthur announced he would not stand for re-election. His successor was the Democrat Grover Cleveland, and the British minister was seen to switch allegiance seamlessly from one president to the next, as he was professionally required to do. But Lionel's charmed life was suddenly jeopardized by Lionel himself. A Californian farmer wrote to Lionel for advice about how he might vote when Cleveland stood for re-election in 1888. Victoria cautioned her father to have nothing to do with the letter, but one day, when Victoria was out of town, Lionel defied her advice and posted the letter. The farmer was revealed to be a Republican trickster. Lionel had broken the cast-iron rule of a professional diplomat's political neutrality. But Lionel and Victoria were once again in luck. A month after the scandal hit the headlines, Lionel's childless brother died, leaving the Sackville title and Knoll, his huge house in Kent, to Lionel, making it diplomatically convenient for him to return to England. In August, Victoria was invited to stay with a relation of her Delaware cousins at their house near Southampton. As she sat down for lunch on the Capability brown-designed lawn, wearing a tight-fitting bodice and a skirt of a pale yellow-striped satin, Victoria felt pleased with her appearance. "Yellow suited me, being rather dark," she explained matter-of-factly in her memoir. And then a young man with beguilingly hooded eyes appeared in front of her on the lawn. He was 22 years old, and his name was Lionel Sackville West, exactly the same as her father's. But this Lionel was her first cousin. At dinner that evening, under the seductive gaze of his steady, conker-coloured eyes and his charmingly gentle smile, Victoria recognized the unmistakable glint of desire. "I felt much disturbed," she wrote nearly 40 years later in the memoir. The next suitor to claim Victoria was not a person, but a place. Knowle has been the Sackville family home for centuries. The Calendar House in Sevenoaks is famous for its show-off statistics, incorporating 365 rooms, 52 staircases, 7 courtyards, and thousands of windows. When the Sackville West family arrived from Washington, Victoria realized that she belonged to the place, and the place to her. She set about the practical task of making a previously dust-sheeted and cobwebbed Knowle comfortable. "I keep house," she would say, boasting in her distinctive French-accented English that keeping house continued to be her chief role as she applied to Knowle those skills that she had learned in Washington. As well as concentrating on the welfare of her father and their guests, Victoria oversaw the 25 indoor servants. Presided over by the housekeeper, Mrs. Knox, and Hicks the butler, the staff included footmen, housemaids and laundrymaids who collectively ensured that spending a Saturday to Monday at Knowle was a covetable invitation. Meanwhile, young Lionel had fallen heart, soul, mind, and, above all, body for his yellow-outfitted cousin. He bombarded her with letters. "I am raving mad for love of you," he wrote in his careful script. Victoria liked a hidden bargain, whether it was a reusable stamp or a cousin who offered something no money could buy, the legitimate right to stay in the house she now adored, and guaranteed cohabitation with her father, the man to whom she had always felt most loyalty. The wedding took place on the 17th of June, 1890. Sevenoaks High Street was decked out in bunting. The town baker had made a spectacular 2-foot-high wedding cake, intended to be an exact model of the house in sponge, and the local schoolchildren threw roses at the nuptial carriage as the newlyweds went off to France on honeymoon. They now discovered the best thing about married life, a mutual exhilaration for uninterrupted sex. Victoria could not get enough of it. She could hardly believe her luck when she realized that no one could prevent Lionel coming into her bedroom any time she or he liked. Mrs. Knox, the housekeeper, was required to turn a blind eye to a previously reliable mistress who now could not bring herself to leave the helter-skelter of the marital sheets. Young Lionel failed his Foreign Office exams, and no one seemed to mind much, especially Victoria. It meant there would be more time to spend in bed. As old Lionel's naturally reserved nature deepened, he withdrew from all but essential social contact. Later that year, Victoria was not surprised to discover that she was pregnant. The physical endurance of having a baby was so traumatic that Victoria was convinced she would die. Eventually, on the 9th of March, 1892, a daughter, Victoria Mary, was born. The name was shortened at once to Vita, so that the mother and daughter could be told apart. Victoria knew at once that she would never put herself through such a dreadful experience again, and risk succumbing to the double-chinned, middle-aged appearance of Pepita. As Victoria concentrated her attention on the child, she felt such intense happiness that when she was 60, she viewed Vita's babyhood as one of my happiest recollections. Old Lionel's reclusiveness became even more marked with the birth of Vita. He developed a fierce antipathy towards all visitors. As soon as a telegram arrived alerting the household that guests were on their way from London, old Lionel would rush to Sevenoaks Station and take the next train in the opposite direction. And as Victoria became ever busier running the house, the estate, and caring for her own daughter, young Lionel, who shared none of these roles, also began to feel marginalized. Victoria remained terrified of becoming pregnant again, and her sexual desertion of young Lionel prompted his desertion of her. During the 1890s, a series of married women volunteered to become Lionel's partner in bridge and tennis. An opera singer called Olive Rubens had become a favourite, and she and her husband were invited to take up residence in a building at Knowle, which Lionel converted into a comfortable apartment. As Lionel retreated still further into the impressively deep cleft of Mrs. Reuben's embrace, early middle age began to erode Victoria's self-confidence, the physical changes falling severely on a woman whose beauty had been celebrated for 20 years. She was lonely. She began to dine alone, indulging a new passion for fresh air and insisting on eating outside, even in the middle of winter, a tray on her knees, half submerged beneath snowflakes. Increasingly, she started to look for something, or preferably someone, who might distract her, protect her, love her. Sir John Murray Scott, known as Siri, was the perfect individual to combine the two roles. A weighty 6'4" figure with white whiskers, blue eyes and rosy cheeks, Siri first filled Victoria's depleted emotional needs, and then her financial requirements. His sudden death in 1912 from a heart attack, just as Victoria was waiting for him to arrive for lunch, crushed her, although the shock was mitigated in part by the extreme generosity of his will. During his lifetime, Siri had given Victoria £84,000, as well as a house in Mayfair, and left her a further £150,000 in his will. Only rarely has a woman in the past few generations of my family broken out of this particular pattern of bargain-making with men. Vita Sackville West was one of them. As Vita took her first infant steps down the straight path that bisects the Green Court at Knowle, followed by an anxious footman and her doting, ageing and forlorn grandfather, an awareness of her own importance as the only child of the house was inevitable. "I am an incredible egoist," she wrote later. "That's the long and the short of it." As soon as Vita was able to run, she vanished into the park, and here her desire for a secret existence began to develop. "Secrecy was my passion," she acknowledged. "It's a trait I inherit from my family, so I won't blame myself excessively for it." Her grandfather, old Lionel, welcomed the companionship of his granddaughter, with her childlike acceptance of his funny ways, and redirected his dwindling resources of affection towards her, until he died in September 1908, aged 81. Indulged in her only child role, Vita was accepted, welcomed and loved as integral to the place by all those who worked there. She tasted cake mixture in the kitchen, watched the gamekeeper skinning a deer for the chef, helped the Knowle painter mix paint, chatted with the undermaids, and spent long hours hanging around with Hicks, the butler. In adulthood, she thought of Knowle in terms of a guardian rather than a lover, because unlike any of her lovers, Knowle remained indispensable. However, an invisible guillotine lurked, waiting to sever Vita from the great house. The inheritance of a title and its associated property could only be handed down the male line. By allowing herself to fall in love with Knowle, she knew that inevitably, when the ownership zigzagged to her male cousin, her heart would be broken. But she took the risk, considering it worthwhile. Vita was educated initially at home, partly by governesses, but more comprehensively by herself, in Knowle's splendid library, where all of English literature and English history opened itself up to her curious mind. She was sent for a while to Miss Wolfe's day school in London, where she made friends with two of the other pupils, Rosamond Grosvenor and Violet Keppel. In 1909, Vita came out as one of the year's most prominent and surprisingly unreluctant debutantes. There were dinners at the Ritz and opulent balls in the private ballrooms of London's grandest houses. Even so, Vita was an aloof oddity among her suitors, an intimidating figure, partly because her shyness was interpreted as disapproval. During the next few years, one dramatic legal case almost shattered her mother Victoria's emotional stability. It was of huge importance to Vita. The inheritance trial was to decide who should inherit Knowle, the house in which Vita had grown up. It came to court in February 1910, a year and a half after old Lionel's death, and centred on the legitimacy of Victoria's brothers and sisters. If Max, Victoria's brother, could prove his father had married Pepita, Knowle would belong to him and not to young Lionel. If Victoria defended her husband's right to retain Knowle, she would necessarily be drawing attention to her adored mother's amorality. Eventually, Victoria decided to fight for the right for herself, young Lionel and Vita to continue to live at Knowle. During the trial, even though Victoria was never called to take the stand, newspapers were once again captivated by Pepita's daughter, by her deep sapphire eyes, her soft dark brown and wavy hair, and her well-proportioned figure, which falls into harmonious curves. After 6 days, the case was won by young Lionel, the illegitimacy of Victoria and her siblings confirmed. The carriage transporting the victorious Sackville West family back home to Knowle was filled with bouquets of orchids and lilies, divested of its smart pair of horses, and accompanied by cheering crowds pulled on ropes by the brawny firemen of Sevenoaks. As Vita sat with her parents in the horseless coach, she shared in the celebratory reprieve, profoundly happy that Knowle was to remain her home for a while longer. Just like her mother before her, Vita continued to reject all enticements to marry, in favour of retaining her position as daughter of the house. But then she met Harold Nicolson, a brilliant young diplomat, born a Victorian and belonging firmly within that world of certainties. Unlike her father's courtship of her mother, Harold's pursuit was intellectual rather than sexual, and therefore, to Vita, much more enticing. "Some men seem born to be lovers," she wrote, "others to be husbands. He belongs to the second category." With the contrast of the dark complexion of her Spanish grandmother and the heavy eyelids of her father's British antecedents, Vita was a woman riddled with the contradicting afflictions of a movie star: ego, self-doubt, and neediness. And even as she accepted Harold's proposal, she was simultaneously allowing an affair with Rosamond Grosvenor to sizzle behind the backs of her parents and her fiancé. Shortly after her 21st birthday, at exactly the age that Pepita had fallen in love with Lionel, Vita set out with Rosamond on a sexually charged visit to Spain, a country which felt partially her own. The trip was an affirmation of Vita's gypsy spirit, and the great allure for the adventure was Pepita. Vita was not too late to find people who remembered her grandmother. Old men spoke of how Pepita had mesmerized every onlooker as she walked down the street, the curl of hair, her sortijilla, coiled high on her cheek, stroking the edge of her ear. Having suffered the deaths of a father and a surrogate father, and having lost the love of her husband, Victoria tried to keep Vita with her for as long as possible, wheedling the loyalty out of her with a diamond necklace, cluttering up further Vita's indecision about whether she belonged more to her parents, her home, or the young man she was due to marry on the 1st of October. 2 weeks before the wedding, Harold remained deeply worried about Vita's fluctuating feelings for him, although he was unequivocal about his for her. He wrote to his fiancée, "You do not care nearly as much for me. I don't mind, really, as all I want is for you to let me adore you." Although Vita wept for an entire hour the night before the wedding, thinking of Knowle and the impending loss of her liberty, the following morning the storm of uncertainty over her marriage had passed. Wearing gold brocade and a long veil of Irish lace, Vita was married by the Bishop of Rochester in the private chapel at Knowle. The bridesmaids were Harold's sister Gwen and a distraught Rosamond Grosvenor, Vita's ex-girlfriend, jilted only days earlier. On the 6th of August, 1914, 3 days after the outbreak of war, Vita gave birth to a son. There was a fight between mother and daughter about the baby's name, with Victoria insisting on Lionel and Vita on Benedict. Victoria sulked, screamed, and threatened. "If Vita prefers the name Benedict to her mother's love, she is welcome to it," was the message delivered to the new mother. "I think she is crazy," an exhausted Vita said to Harold. Just 1 year later, Vita was apprehensive but excited at the prospect of the birth of a second child, certain of a sister for Ben. The baby was due at the end of September, but by the end of October, nearly 5 weeks late, there was still no sign that the baby was ready to arrive. Eventually, on the 1st of November, Vita was put under anaesthetic for 5 hours, and the 9-pound baby was delivered. The little boy, a second son, had died before there had been a chance of life. Physically, Vita was left black and blue from the ordeal. Emotionally, she was desperately shaken, her need for Harold never greater. In January 1917, a third son, a survivor, my father, was born in London. But Vita's ability to make sons felt particularly poignant both to Vita and her mother. Ben and Nigel had both arrived in the wrong generation, too late to inherit. Soon after their marriage, the Nicholsons bought Long Barn, an ancient house. It was only a mile away from Knowle and had the potential to make a lovely garden. One day, in May 1919, Victoria caught her husband in an embrace with his mistress Olive Rubens beneath the tulip trees, kissing like any soldier and his girl in the park, an occupation that was not much in accord with their both saying to me that their friendship was purely platonic. She announced she had suffered enough. She was leaving. She loaded up 7 luggage vans with her possessions and left Knowle forever. She moved permanently to Brighton, but never agreed to divorce her husband. Victoria now imposed on her daughter a further 20 years of blackmail, alternating blame with neediness, while Vita responded with pity, affection, exasperation, and guilt. In January 1928, young Lionel became ill with a flu that developed into an inflammation around the heart. His death came quickly. Victoria remained in Brighton, shaken and excluded. For a few extraordinary days, Vita had Knowle to herself at last, the solitary chatelaine organising a funeral, a daughter making autonomous decisions that needed no ratification from anyone, a daughter at last in charge at Knowle. But within the week, the huge mental strain that had been building up within Victoria over many years, stretching back even to the death of her mother, finally reached its climax, and she fell apart. On a piece of blue paper torn from an exercise book that I found hidden among Vita's things, Victoria's huge and chaotic black writing covers both sides of the page. Referring now to Vita as Viper, Victoria expelled all her misery and isolation in a letter to Vita. "You are a selfish, callous, ungrateful child to the best mother anyone could ever have had." Vita was at a loss about how to handle her mother's breakdown. Victoria then refused to speak to Vita for nearly 2 years, communicating with her only through her grandsons. Soon, her physical health began to deteriorate. The day after her death, on the 30th of January 1936, Vita wrote in her diary that she felt as if she had been hit over the head with a mallet. Eventually, Vita recovered from the death of her parents, but never from the loss of Noel, now owned by her Uncle Charlie. The final childhood link to the place she loved above all other had gone. Sissinghurst, a once grand Elizabethan manor house in the Weald of Kent, was a place crying out for rescue. When Vita first saw the crumbling walls and the graceful Elizabethan tower at its heart, one rainy day in March 1930, her response to this broken place was visceral. She fell, in my father's words, flat in love with it. After many months of clearing away centuries of rubble, Vita and Harold made a home there. They slept in separate bedrooms in the south cottage, above Harold's workroom. Vita had the exclusive use of the tower for her own writing. There were generous spaces in their marital togetherness, and for my grandparents, that was the secret to contentment. Sissinghurst became Vita's refuge. It mattered to her more than anyone or anything, except Harold and Noel. And it was at Sissinghurst that Vita could write, and at Sissinghurst, in the earth on which it sits, where her creativity found its enduring memorial. Her distinguished reputation as a horticulturalist grew quickly, partly through her newspaper articles, but especially through her garden. Its originality, intimacy, and romance has made it one of the most famous, most visited, most copied and loved gardens in the world. Sissinghurst felt to Vita like Noel's younger sibling, and any suggestion that it might also one day be owned and managed by the National Trust prompted a rage of defence. In 1954, when her son Nigel floated the idea, Vita's response in her diary was unequivocal. Au grand jamais, jamais, never, never, never. Not that hard little plate at my door. Nigel can do what he likes when I'm dead, but as long as I live, no Nat Trust or any other foreign body shall have my darling. Over my corpse or my ashes, not otherwise. It is bad enough to have lost my Noel, but they shan't take Sissinghurst from me. That, at least, is my own. Isolation became essential to Vita's creativity. However, there was a time when too much of it tipped into loneliness. Both Harold and Vita were enthusiastic, lifelong sherry drinkers, but during the war, when Harold was away in London for long periods at a time, and Sissinghurst lay beneath the flight path that German bombers took to make their raids on London, Vita found that alcohol helped her to pass the dark and frightening nights, as well as alleviating the pain of creeping arthritis. On returning to find her muzzy, Harold would revert to his habit of avoiding discussion of uncomfortable personal truths face to face, and resort to letters. While Harold had frequent, if short-lived, flings with beautiful young men, Vita indulged in passionate, sexually charged affairs with, at some estimates, a total of more than 50 women. She was predatory, and her sexual veracity included poets, journalists, butch women, feminine women, neighbours, and even her own sister-in-law. Some of her lovers had been heterosexually content until trapped in Vita's lustful headlights, most famously Virginia Woolf. If Noel had been her source of strength for the first 36 years of Vita's life, Sissinghurst and Harold were the props of her later years. Harold became a biographer, a broadcaster, and a celebrated diarist. He died in 1968, but his distinguished professional and literary reputation has endured. Motherhood baffled Vita. She had little understanding of or interest in children. My father Nigel and his brother Ben grew up admiring but fearful of her. Neither of them had any experience of what it was like to be nurtured by, or indeed to nurture, a woman. There are some joyful pictures of my mother Philippa at a picnic in 1946, aged 19, loafing around, playing leapfrog, being silly, unself-conscious, happy. They are precious pictures, the only ones I have of her at this time in her life, when she was so obviously free from any anxiety at all. Nigel Nicolson was 12 years older than Philippa, tall and dark, with a creditable war record in the Grenadier Guards, and now the Conservative Member of Parliament for Bournemouth East. They met at a cocktail party, and he was touched by her sweetness. He was in his late 30s and unmarried. A wife would enhance his professional reputation. 5 weeks later, and having met no more than half a dozen times, Nigel proposed. A gasp, some tears, acceptance and champagne all followed as my mother's parents congratulated Nigel on his arrangement to take Philippa off our hands. Soon afterwards, Nigel took the train to London, leaving a bemused Philippa alone with her parents. The following morning, Nigel woke up thinking, "My God, what have I done?" In his unpublished memoir, he cites the fact that his fiancée was barely educated as his earliest fear for the long-term success of their marriage. In July 1953, photographers from the press were waiting to record the first sight of the new Mrs. Nicolson, who emerged from St. Margaret's, Westminster, on the arm of her husband in a gown of oyster satin, looking young, happy, and cautiously confident. Following close behind were the respective mothers. Vita in a black straw hat, pearl necklace, and sensible flat shoes. Philippa's mother Pamela in strappy toeless sandals. Both looked miserable. The fathers were all merry buttonholes and cheerful optimism. On the first night of the honeymoon at Sissinghurst, the excuse of tiredness postponed for the nervous couple what on the second night was described by my father as an ordeal. He rated his own performance as adequate, hardly the trumpet blast and clashing of cymbals a virginal bride in love might expect, even wish for. That autumn, the local doctor confirmed that Philippa was to have a baby. With almost audible relief, Nigel observed in his diary that Philippa was engrossed in something at last. 10 decorously punctual months after the wedding, a daughter was born. They called the baby Juliet, and all seemed well enough until a few months later when a frail-looking Philippa was diagnosed with tuberculosis. There was to be complete bed rest for 4 months, with as little movement as possible. She continued her long convalescence with regular beneficial visits to the healing sunshine at her parents' villa in the south of France. 2 years after Philippa had been given the all-clear from tuberculosis, a son, Adam, was born, and for a while our growing family seemed happy enough. But Philippa was drifting away from Nigel, squeezed out from his attention by the demands and anxieties of his work, and not interested enough in that work to make herself a sympathetic companion. When my left-leaning father was forced to resign his parliamentary seat over his disagreement with the government over the Suez crisis, there was no longer any need to live near his old constituency. On the 12th of January 1961, we moved to London. And in London, everything began to go wrong. Nigel had moved out of Philippa's room when she became ill and had never gone back. Every day he went to work at the publishing house he had founded with George Weidenfeld in 1948. His all-consuming career, his critical intellect, and his failure to make love to her swamped, stifled, and depressed her. A month after we moved to London, she flew off alone to the south of France, leaving Adam and me to settle into new schools. Our new house in Chelsea was just off the unsmart end of the King's Road. Council houses and blocks of flats had replaced the Victorian slums and stood among the Georgian terraces. A year after we moved to London, I developed osteomyelitis in my left leg, a serious infection of the bone marrow that can lead to amputation if not treated with urgency. I was taken immediately to Great Ormond Street Hospital, and after the operation my mother brought me a pale, gauzy bed jacket edged in pink swansdown. I had never seen her so frightened. On the day I left hospital, my mother cooked my favourite supper, and as I ate the hamburger, chips and frozen peas, followed by ice cream rolled in sponge for pudding, I had never been happier to be home. But a couple of weeks later, she left for a holiday in the Bahamas with her new friends from Saint-Tropez. I was not enjoying school, and my report said I did not take part in sports or indeed in the classroom. I felt unsatisfactory, a word weighted with doom and used by both my parents with unhesitating frequency. And then a new teacher arrived. Her name was Mrs. Fitzgerald. She taught us English, history and scripture, and she lived on a boat on the Thames. Swinging her legs as she sat on the teacher's table, facing the class, she would time-travel us schoolgirls away from 1960s London and into the world of Dickens's Tale of Two Cities. How could any of us have known that she was managing an alcoholic husband, trying to keep her daughters in food and clothing, darkening that grey-red hair with a tea bag for economy, and eating chalk for nourishment? How was I to know that the showiness of Chelsea was to re-emerge years later in a wonderful novel called Offshore by Penelope Fitzgerald? All I knew was that Mrs. Fitzgerald's lessons were better than any of the other lessons, and made going to school fun for the first time. At home, my mother's life in London was unravelling too. Even when she was not in France, she never seemed to be around when she was needed and wanted. During Vita's lifetime, we were frequent visitors to Sissinghurst. The contrast between Vita and my mother was evident even to a small girl. Philippa in her belted summer dress, Vita long-limbed in breeches and knee-length lace-up boots. A creamy pearl necklace hung in the indent of her neck above a silk shirt. Her earrings dangled low, the jewellery her only concessions to the conventions of her sex. Sitting next to her at lunch, I was close enough to inhale the tobacco impregnation of her flattened hair. She was terrifying and thrilling, as tall as my father, her voice aristocratic, deep, silky, seductive, disturbing. In the spring of 1962, she was diagnosed with bowel cancer. Nigel took Adam and me to Sissinghurst to say goodbye. Vita sat in a deck chair on the lawn, her knees covered by a favourite rug made from cream and pale brown llama skin, the rumble of her deep, tobacco-y laugh and the expression of delight softening a face exhausted by illness. She died a few weeks later on the 2nd of June, on a glorious early summer's day. That evening, our father came, as usual, to read us a bedtime story, but instead lay down briefly beside me and closed his eyes. When he drew the curtains and went downstairs, leaving me in darkness, I could feel the wetness of his tears on my pillow. Vita left Sissinghurst to my father Nigel in her will, and we moved in at once. But Vita's legacy proved to be a financial headache for my father, especially with the punitive inheritance taxes of 1962. Over the next few years, Nigel devoted himself to negotiations with the National Trust, who eventually accepted the house and garden for the nation in lieu of the tax. Despite his mother's jamais, jamais echoing in his mind, he signed the agreement. The family was to be allowed to live in the house and garden rent-free in perpetuity. He had saved Vita and Harold's beautiful creation for posterity. After a while, we left London to live at Sissinghurst full-time, and my mother's position as mistress of that lovely place seemed briefly to give her confidence. Just as Victoria had found when entrusted with the running of Knowle, the beauty of Sissinghurst provided an almost human ability to nurture. Philippa took a new interest in things, but she was lonely, with even fewer friends in the country than she had in London. If the grown-ups were preoccupied with their adult anxieties, Sissinghurst was the best thing that had ever happened to me. This is the place, in all its tumbling, flowery romance, that matters to me more than any other. My certainty whenever I am uncertain. When I am alone there, late on a summer evening, I can sense Vita's presence in the shed where her gardening tools are kept, in the sunken garden on the lower courtyard, on the far side of the moat, in her own bedroom. After she died, Harold continued to live in the cottage he had once shared with Vita. Without her, he was almost inconsolable, incapable of shaking off his grief. One day, when we came across the garden to see him, he was searching for a book. "No one will ever call me Hadji again," he said very slowly, holding open a book with an inscription that Vita had written on the flyleaf. Throughout their marriage, Vita had called him Hadji, what she understood to be the diminutive Arab word for old man, and the sight of the word in her handwriting had suddenly overwhelmed him. "We will," I said. Hadji was made demonstrably happy by us coming to live permanently at Sissinghurst. He invited physical affection. I would run the length of the long yew-walk at top speed as he waited for me at the other end, a white figure in his cream linen trousers and bashed-up Panama, holding out his arms wide as I hurled myself into his embrace. My mother was becoming more and more unhappy. Her existence at Sissinghurst had been made more uncomfortable by her reluctant agreement to condense 4 of Vita's gardening books into one volume for publication. She had always shown a real interest in the garden, which Nigel appreciated and valued, and he thought this suggestion would give her an occupation. The lack of confidence and the seeking of approval where there was none were familiar. Every one of the women who preceded me in our family had felt like this at times. Pepita had felt judged and shamed in Arcachon. Victoria had felt marginalized and cast off by Lionel. Vita had not met her own rigorous standards, and now Philippa was trapped by Nigel's harsh treatment of her and by her own lack of self-belief. During the summer of 1969, the Rolling Stones lamented how a lack of sexual satisfaction leads to a deeper sense of isolation. And, as if she had by now given up on Sissinghurst, Nigel, marriage, the beauty of the pink dusk, and on us children, Philippa went off on one of her regular visits to stay in Saint-Tropez. And there she fell in love, not only with a man, but with another kind of life. The new existence was offered to her by Robin McAlpine, a wealthy widower. The tug of the older man, a father figure, protector and provider, attracted her. On the 1st of May, 1968, Hadji died at Sissinghurst of a heart attack while undressing for bed. A joint memorial service for Harold and Vita was held at St. James's, Piccadilly, and we children were given a day off school to attend. I found the outing thrillingly sad. My mother drove me back to school for the spring term with my trunk in the boot of the car. Sitting outside the school gate in her green Rover with the cream leather seats, whose smell made me feel sick, she told me that she and Nigel were getting divorced. She would be leaving forever, she explained. We were used to the leaving, but not the forever. Her words held the physical sting of a slap. I stepped into a vacancy created by a mother's absence. My second school was only a few miles from Sissinghurst, and at Saturday lunchtime Nigel's orange Vanden Plus would be waiting to take me home. Having sent him a shopping list by post from school earlier in the week, I would change out of my uniform into jeans and knock up cauliflower cheese, macaroni cheese, cheese on toast, cheese and biscuits, and an oddly, infallibly delicious chocolate mousse. I was a sensitive teenager, and what I wanted more than anything was Nigel's approval. So I was not in the least resentful, did not feel exploited, enjoying the part I played in his life, happy to make my own patriarchal bargain. My mother's second marriage was not working out. She had become frightened of her new husband, and she had begun to drink. She became bloated and reddened, angry and amnesiac, unloving and unreachable. She died when she was 58, exactly the same age as her mother was when she died. I have never known a purer feeling than motherhood. The 2 days on which I gave birth to my daughters remain the most precious of my life. We called our first daughter Clementine, Clemmy for short. With her arrival, the role that daughterhood had occupied in my life shifted its emphasis. Until then, other than marriage to James and to an extent my professional life, daughterhood had defined me and identified me. But with motherhood, I reached a point of clarity. My daughter joined my husband as the pivots of my emotional life. When Flora was born in New York in March 1985, the completing, deepening, blessed sense that motherhood brings was reinforced once again. James and I had married young, and as we grew up and our own separate interests developed, we drifted apart. And then I discovered a way to cheer myself up. Alcohol. Although the cause of my mother's death remained raw and salutary, for some inexplicable or cruelly genetic reason, I confused the identical poison with curative medicine. Some mothers in my family had not chosen survival. My own mother had given up in middle age. Victoria, a little older, had also eventually retreated to self-pitying and angry isolation. Any urge to fight had left them both. I felt I was genetically woven into repetitive surrender, and did not know if I had the courage or the strength to snap the thread and interrupt the pattern. I had arrived at a midway point in my life. At last I realized I did not want to die. Not because of me, but because of my love for my daughters. I went to a treatment centre in London. Sobriety returned me to life. The first and best thing was seeing how happy it made Clemmy and Flora. When my daughters were not with their father, but in England, Sissinghurst was the place of safety for us all. During these years, I loved being my father's daughter, happy that my own children were getting to know him so well. We lived a lot by old habits. In the olden days, Nigel would begin, prompting fake groans. The girls went to a day school in London, round the corner from our new home, a little terraced house in Chelsea, and we all began to settle into this new city life. The house became the refuge for a tightly bonded, even formidable threesome, a house full of daughters. And then we sold our daughter house as I moved away to live in the country, and they went to share flats in London with girlfriends. After a while, I met Charlie, a man who was prepared to put his trust in me, and I discovered how it is possible to learn from the mistakes of the past, blessed to find such a deep and enduring happiness. As my daughters formed adult relationships of their own, I hoped we would be able to preserve our mother-daughter closeness while allowing the boundaries necessary for independence to be recognized and respected. And then I faced the inevitable change that I had dreaded all my adult life. The leukemia came upon my father gradually. A weakness in the knee, a slowness in his walk, a faltering when climbing aboard a boat in Ireland, which would previously have set him no challenge. He passed each incident off as arthritis. But this unprecedented fallibility did not yet deter him from continuing to work, to write reviews, to complete an index for a new edition of his father's letters. And then, one February morning, his physical strength gave way. The poem my father had asked me to read at his funeral is taken from Vita's long pastoral song called The Land. It remains my favourite of all her poetry, encapsulating Sissinghurst and all she felt about it, the beauty of the garden handed down to us, her lucky, lucky grandchildren, and to our own equally fortunate children and grandchildren. She walks among the patterned, pied brocade, each flower her son, and every tree her daughter. Last summer, I went to Arcachon with my daughters and my granddaughter Imogen. We wanted to see where the beginnings of this story had ended. And we wanted to watch Imo feel the warm French sand on her toes, just as Pepita's children had done long ago. Towards the end of Boulevard de la Plage, we spotted the large metal gates through which Pepita and her tiny kindergarten had swept on their way to the beach. But the building was no longer there. The day my granddaughter was born felt like the last day of my youth, my own childbearing years still a vivid memory. And yet, rather than accentuating my own mortality, as I had expected, grandparenthood has deepened the experience of living. I have thought of the great good fortune my granddaughter has in being born into an increasingly tolerant generation, one that is determined not to repeat the mistakes of the past, something I realize is possibly the entire point of this book. Imogen's first name has its origins in the old Irish dialect. It means beloved daughter.
A House Full of Daughters by Juliet Nicolson, abridged for radio by Libby Spurrier, was read by Juliet Stevenson and produced by Celia de Wolfe. It was a Pier production for the BBC.